Welcome to the GPU hierarchy. I've already shown some numbers for the performance of the RTX 5060, but let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. I'm using the ASUS 5060 Dual, just like I used the 5050 Dual. Has a few little extras. ASUS talks about their better bonding and protection of the GPU itself. The card basically looks the same. 2 fans, nothing really special to note here. There are the usual telltale signs. PCI Express 5.0 slot has the little T marks. The cooler looks more than sufficient for a 145 watt GPU. Triple DisplayPort 2.1b, single HDMI 2.1b, and of course we've got the single 8-pin PCIe connector. Flow through on the back fan helps with cooling, and overall it's a pretty decent seeming budget card. And I've already talked about this in the 5050. The problem with the 5050 is it's only $50 cheaper than the 5060, and the 5060 offers 30 to 50% more performance depending on the game and the benchmark. But let's go ahead and jump straight into the benchmarks, shall we? I have a lot of charts, so I'm going to try and keep this straight and to the point, starting with 1080p medium. We have basically the same performance as the 4060 Ti. Now, the 4060 Ti had 8GB and 16GB models, just like the 5060 Ti. At 1080p medium, there's not really a difference between those two. Performance is a little bit better than the prior generation 3060 Ti, and it's of course slower than the 9060 XT 16GB card, which is a more expensive card. Also faster than the 6750 XT, 6700 XT. Overall, it looks pretty decent. It's about a 25% performance upgrade from the prior generation 4060, which also had 8GB of VRAM. Moving on quickly to power, 134 watts on average used, so 10 watts below the stated rating, but we are at 1080p medium, so that makes sense. It's a relatively power efficient card, as we see here when we convert that to power efficiency. Pretty much tied with the 4060 Ti. 4060 is a little bit lower, 5060 Ti did a little bit better. AMD is trailing a little bit in efficiency, though it's interesting to note. We can also look at clock speeds. 2.74 gigahertz. It's running about 200-ish megahertz faster than the official boost clock that ASUS gives us, and that's pretty common for Nvidia cards. They have a conservative boost clock. You can see the big jump between the 30 series and 20 series up to the newer 40 and 50 series. Both AMD and Nvidia have made improvements in that time frame where their GPUs started clocking a lot faster. And finally, let's look at temperatures. This is mostly about just looking at the specific card. So the ASUS card is running at 63 degrees Celsius on average, well within reasonable limits. We'd like to keep it probably below 75-ish degrees Celsius. That's not a hard and fast limit, just kind of where I would recommend running your GPU. Now let's go ahead and go through all of the games. I'm going to try and do them 10 seconds apiece. Quiet Place, The Road Ahead, Unreal Engine 5. Performance is near the upper end of our chart and looks okay at 82 frames per second. Next up, Black Myth Wukong. No ray tracing enabled because that would kill performance on a card like this. Basically tied with the 4060 Ti. Remember, we're not memory limited yet. Control Ultimate, we have ray tracing enabled. Nvidia does well here. The 5060 actually beats the 4060 Ti and the 9060 XT instantly. Cyberpunk 2077, also with ray tracing enabled, using medium settings, and we're in that same ballpark, doing fine. Dragon Age The Veilguard, still getting 100 frames per second. Minimums are a lot lower here, and that's just part and parcel for the game. That's how the game is built. Areas run slow. Final Fantasy 16, this one tends to hit memory bandwidth and capacity a little bit more. Getting below 60 frames per second, still playable. Flight Simulator, also running just fine. Looks like there were some driver improvements recently, so the 4060 Ti looks a little worse there on the minimums. God of War Ragnarok, also running fine, over 100 frames per second. And keep in mind, this is all at 1080p native, no DLSS is running. MechWarrior 5 Clans, 100 frames per second. This is another Unreal Engine 5 game, doing just fine. Basically, everything at 1080p medium should do great. Monster Hunter Wilds, getting 74 frames per second. This one does not scale to really high frame rates, so this is totally acceptable and looks fine. Spider-Man 2, 112 frames per second. You'll see this one actually 16 gigabytes versus 8 gigabytes did help on some of the GPUs. Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl, running above 60 FPS. It won't do that at epic settings, but we'll get to those next. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, with ray tracing it's required, getting well above 120 FPS, so totally playable. Unfortunately, VRAM is an issue at higher settings. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, also totally playable at over 100 frames per second. And last but not least, we have one more Unreal Engine 5 game, Witchfire, and this one's less demanding, and so it's screaming along at 202 frames per second. Great. Now let's go ahead and bump up to ultra settings, and everything is going to run much slower here. Starting with the overall look at performance, we've dropped from 100 FPS on average down to about 60. Basically tied with the 4060 Ti 8GB, but the 16 gig version does start to see an advantage here, and part of that is going to be because at least one of the games, Indiana Jones, does not run at 1080p ultra settings on an 8GB Nvidia card. Kind of interesting because it does run okay on non-Nvidia GPUs. Even though it seems to run out of memory, it struggles and stutters a bit, but it still actually runs, whereas with Nvidia 8 gig cards, it just crashes to desktop. Power use, still about 10 watts below the rated power. Some games are using closer to the 145 watt rating, others are less. Convert that to efficiency, still looking pretty good. I mean, the 4060 Ti, 4060 versus 5060, we didn't change process nodes, so there shouldn't be a big change. Clock speeds about the same, 2.75 gigahertz. And last up, we have the temperatures, which are running at about the same 63, 64 degrees Celsius on average. So the card's well within reasonable operating limits. Flipping through the games again, 54 frames per second on A Quiet Place. That's playable, no problems. But we are starting to hit the limits of the cards. Black Myth Wukong, also a big drop down to 41 frames per second this time. Not hitting VRAM limits, just it needs more compute. Control Ultimate ray tracing with the Ultra preset really drops performance quite a bit. We're down to 40 FPS. AMD's GPUs get hit even harder. Cyberpunk with ray tracing as well, 40 FPS. We are seeing some differentiation between the 4060 Ti and the 5060 here. Dragon Age the Veilguard, big gap between minimums and average. Again, that's just where I'm testing in the game. Still getting 67 FPS on average. Final Fantasy 16, also down in that 40 to 45 frames per second range, depending on where you are in the game. Some areas do run faster. Flight Simulator, we're dropping below 60, but we're still doing okay for the most part. It's playable. We'll start to see more struggles at 1440p though. God of War Ragnarok, no problems here. VRAM capacity isn't an issue at 1080p ultra settings, so that's good to see, at least in some games. MechWarrior 5 Clans, this is another Unreal Engine 5 game, and it's still running fine at over 60 FPS on average, without DLSS again. Monster Hunter Wilds, also getting right about 60 frames per second, 63 frames per second, so playable. Could use DLSS to boost performance a bit. Spider-Man 2, doing okay. VRAM does start to matter quite a bit more at the ultra settings, or very high in this case. Stalker 2, this is about as far as you'll get with 1080p epic settings in Stalker 2, and we're getting just below 60, so turn on DLSS, you're okay. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Now look at those AMD cards at the bottom that have 8 gig. They all plummet into terrible performance range, but they actually do allow you to run the game. The 5060, all of the 8 gigabyte Nvidia cards, they just crap out and say, nope, you don't have enough VRAM, and they don't let you even try to run it. I mean, look at the 3060 there with 12 gig. That's a 2 generations old card pulling 75 frames per second. This is purely a driver thing in Nvidia with Vulkan RT support. So I don't know what they need to fix, but they really ought to fix this because they promoted this game. That's kind of funny in my book. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, no problems there, getting almost 100 frames per second still. And then last but not least, we have Witchfire, which is cruising along at 141 frames per second still, a lighter game. So still very much playable for the most part at 1080p ultra settings, but you will get games where you're dropping well below 60. We are staying well above 30 frames per second though, so that's fine. Kicking up to 1440p ultra. Now we averaged 60 at 1080p Ultra, we're down to 40 now. So definitely taking a hit on performance at every level, but still playable in most of the games, I would say. It's going to differ depending on the game and engine and how much VRAM the game wants, but you can definitely use 1440p, especially if you turn on upscaling. Like you're doing about 1080p rendering with quality mode, so you'd look a lot like the 1080p performance. If you go to performance mode, you could do 720p upscaled to 1440p and actually get higher performance than what you typically see at 1080p native. Let's go ahead and look at the power charts. Nothing really changed here. Most of the GPUs don't really change a lot from the various settings, but it's just good to check and make sure things look fine. If we look at efficiency, still in that same ballpark of right around 4060 Ti efficiency levels, a little bit higher than the 8 gig, a little bit lower than the 16 gig, the 16 gig being benefited because it has more memory. Clock speeds dropped just fractionally from 1080p and still well within the expected range. And finally, temperature's not a problem at all. Going through the games themselves, A Quiet Place, we're now dropping below 30 frames per second on a regular basis. That's why the minimum's at 25. So you will get some stuttering. Some of the areas will be more graphically intensive as well, so that's worth noting. Turning on DLSS and or frame generation is definitely a recommended option. Black Myth Wukong, barely at 30 frames per second on average. Turning on DLSS again would fix a lot of this, or dropping the settings one notch to high is another thing you could do. Control Ultimate with ray tracing at maxed out settings, obviously that's not going to fly really well on these type of cards. It is running, getting 22 frames per second. You could maybe boost that to 30 to 40 if you turn on higher levels of DLSS upscaling, but really you could drop down to the high RT settings and it doesn't look that much different. Cyberpunk, 19 frames per second. Now on this one, notice the big gap between the minimums and the average, and then look at the 5060 Ti and 4060 Ti with 16 gig. So the huge gap is because we've run into VRAM issues. So we're getting some stuttering because we don't have enough VRAM. Definitely would need to lower the settings and or enable upscaling and frame generation. Dragon Age the Veilguard, still actually pretty playable if you're targeting 30 frames per second. Again, DLSS would be your beneficiary here. And all of these games that I've tested actually do support DLSS, which I can't say about FSR and XeSS. I didn't go out and search for games that had DLSS support. This is just what I came up with for relatively recent games and a couple of older ray tracing titles. So DLSS puts Nvidia in the lead consistently if you're willing to use it. Final Fantasy 16, 30 frames per second on average, some stuttering here, and definitely not a great experience depending on where you are in the game. Flight Simulator, still breaking 30 FPS. There are some oddities here, like the 6 gig 2060 just choked, so it needed more memory than that. The 3050 is actually slower on compute, but has more memory, so you can see we're right between that 6 and 8 gig memory used. God of War Ragnarok still doing fine, no problems there. That's kind of nice to see that there are games that don't need more memory. 8 gig is still very common actually in the hardware world. Not that I would want a new card to have 8 gig, but there are so many out there from the 30 and 20 series as well as AMD side that it's worth game developers targeting 8 gig as a reasonable option. MechWarrior 5 Clans, we're pulling 41 frames per second, so we're well below 60 now, but still staying above 30. Depending on what you consider smooth, that's still playable, and you can turn on upscaling and frame generation if you want. Monster Hunter Wilds, basically running in that same ballpark as well. 40 to 50 frames per second, depending on where you are in the game. And this is a more demanding level that I tested, so other areas of the game do run a little bit better. Spider-Man 2, this one definitely starts to run out of VRAM. So I've got a good performance run on these cards for the most part. Like the 3050 8 gig struggled, but most of these cards didn't seem like they were totally running out of VRAM. But if you play for longer, you can see big drops in performance. Stalker 2, this one is kind of interesting because depending on when and how and where you test, the 8 gig cards from Nvidia either work or they collapse horribly. So the 3060 Ti, 2060 Super, 5050, and 2060 all totally collapsed on their performance. But then the 3050 did okay. The 5060 does fine, the 4060 does okay. If you play the game for a couple hours at a time, I think you'll definitely run into issues at epic settings with the 5060 and other 8 gig cards, so this is kind of your best case scenario for an Unreal Engine 5 game like Stalker 2. Indiana Jones, still no 8 gig Nvidia card, so it's a fail there. That totally hurts the average, but this is also important to know that there are games that it simply won't run because of a lack of VRAM. Warhammer 40k, still doing fine, actually averaging over 60. It's one of the higher performance games in our suite, and that also applies to the last game, Witchfire, which is running at 90 frames per second. And that's with Unreal Engine 5. So you can make a high performance game with Unreal Engine 5. You just can't do all the graphical options and settings and max out all of that stuff and expect high performance. Wrapping things up, I did test 4K Ultra. It's kind of a ludicrous setting to test on the 5060, so I'm not going to take a lot of time here, but overall performance, we're getting in the mid-teens. Lots of games really struggle. Power use has dropped to 111 watts on average, which means the card is nowhere near running at its capabilities. It's basically waiting for other stuff, probably transferring stuff over the PCI Express bus because it ran out of VRAM, and that has caused the average to drop 20 watts, 25 watts. Efficiency also takes a hit, tied with the 4060 Ti 8 gig still, but you see the 16 gig cards are doing much better overall because they didn't run out of VRAM. Clock speeds still plenty high. In fact, they might have crept up a little bit because the GPU is clocking high because it's actually not doing compute, it's waiting for things to come in from memory to transfer over the PCI Express bus. And temperatures also dropped about 6 degrees because the GPU is not working as hard, it's waiting for memory. Most of these games are going to be running well below 20 frames per second and often in the single digits. A Quiet Place gets 11 frames per second, 13 frames per second for Black Myth Wukong, and we're not even maxed out on settings for Black Myth. There's still the cinematic setting, which drops performance another 40% or something. Control Ultimate, 6 frames per second. Yeah, that's not good. Cyberpunk, also 5 frames per second, equally bad. Dragon Age the Veilguard, still getting 20, hasn't totally run out of VRAM, but look at the 16 gig cards versus their 8 gig counterparts, and we are definitely penalized if you don't have more memory. Final Fantasy 16, getting 16 frames per second. Flight Simulator, also hitting VRAM limits pretty hard, as you can tell by this, getting 13 frames per second here. God of War Ragnarok, we're sitting at 33 frames per second, so technically kind of playable, and this is one of those where turning on DLSS would actually make this viable. MechWarrior 5 dropped down to 11 frames per second, definitely not a great experience. Monster Hunter Wilds doubles that to 22 frames per second, still not a great experience, but maybe viable with frame generation and upscaling enabled. Spider-Man 2, 21 frames per second. Again, upscaling and frame gen, if you're even trying for 4K, might get you there. But memory requirements don't totally go away just because you're using upscaling and frame gen, so keep that in mind. Stalker 2, this is one that it's laughably bad. So 1.2 frames per second. There's nothing you can do to fix that other than not running at 4K. I mean, DLSS does help though because it's not rendering at 4K. Indiana Jones still doesn't run. Warhammer Space Marine 2, we're getting 30 frames per second, so you could maybe make that viable with upscaling and frame gen. And finally, Witchfire, which is the highest performing game, I believe, of our suite at 45 frames per second. So there you have it. That wraps up the 5060 review. The big problem with this is Nvidia walked back from 12 gigabytes of VRAM on a 192-bit interface with the 3060 and shifted to a 128-bit interface with 8 gig of VRAM, and they have more L2 cache to provide higher levels of bandwidth, so it doesn't totally kill performance, but when you run out of VRAM, you run out of VRAM hard, and we are seeing that in more and more games these days. You basically don't want to go above high settings in a lot of games, especially if you're playing at 1440p or maybe 4K, but this really isn't a 4K card, so I get that. It's not a terrible card. It's way better than the 5050 because it has more memory bandwidth, it has like 50% more compute shaders and all that stuff, and so performance is a big step up from the 5050 for $50 more. It's almost like the 5050 exists to show that, hey, the 5060 isn't that bad. But really, if it were me, what I would want would be something closer to like the 9060 XT 16 gig though, which costs $350-ish. The 5060 Ti 16 gig, that's technically $430, but I have seen them go on sale at Walmart for $380. So if you could stretch to that 16 gig mark for an extra $80, I would do it. I would not lock myself into an 8 gig card here in 2025 just when there's so many games that are pushing beyond 8 gig. Like Borderlands 4 technically can run on an 8 gig card, but only at medium settings pretty much. Like if you turn on 1080p high, you will go past 8 gig of VRAM, and so you'll get frequent stutters. Overall, I'm really just disappointed that Nvidia has all these 8 gig cards in the 50 series. The 5060 Ti, the 5060, and the 5050 all have 8 gig. It would have been so much better if they had used 3 GB GDDR7. The 5060 and 5060 Ti at least could have had 12 gig. It would have addressed a host of problems with performance. Would have maybe cost an extra $20. It would have definitely been worthwhile, but Nvidia is not interested in worthwhile. They're interested in the bottom line, and they're making crap tons of money off of AI right now, so I get it. Gamers are no longer their primary focus. We should just be happy that they gave us a card at all. That's kind of their attitude, and I'm not saying we should be happy. I'm saying we need AMD and Intel to compete more, and unfortunately the B580, which costs less than the 5060, it's a pretty big step down in performance. Like the only thing good about the B580 now is that it's got 12 gig of VRAM, which does keep it competitive in some of the games, but drivers are still a big issue on Intel. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm working on other content and I would appreciate your support. Until next time, take care.